So I just want to thank everyone for joining our third meeting here for the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group. So we're going to get started. Start with a little housekeeping. Actually, I think we need the slides pulled up here. Sorry. Go. Okay, got it now. Sorry. Okay, take two. We'll start with a little housekeeping. Just ask folks to please mute yourselves when not speaking. This will prevent any feedback or echo. Please feel free to enter comments in the chat or raise your hand to ask questions. But we do prefer comments made out loud and make sure we capture everything in the meeting minutes. So when you are speaking, please identify yourself so we have that for the record. And just a reminder, this meeting will be recorded and the recordings and minutes will be posted online. So we can go to the next slide. We'll just walk through the agenda. Are you guys seeing the slides progress? Sorry, there we go. Okay. So we'll start off giving everyone just an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll talk through some of the best practices and recommendations for workforce development. And then we'll spend the bulk of today's discussion on key findings from the other working groups, and how those help inform recommendations from this working group. And then we'll wrap up with some discussion on next steps. Next slide. We just want to have a quick reminder on Stratagen's role. We're handling the meeting facilitation, planning, logistics, the meeting minutes, along with recordings, which will be made publicly available, as I mentioned. And we're also handling technical assistance and research to support the working group. So just wanted to put that out ahead here. So as we start to begin, I want to ask everyone to please share your name, title, and organization. I'll kick us off, and then I'll go down the list to prompt everyone. I'm Joe Goodenberry. I'm a senior manager with Stratagen. I'll pass to my colleagues at Stratagen Consulting, Aaron, Nina, and Kaya, if you want to just introduce yourselves.
Good morning, everyone. This is Erin Childs with the Stratagen team. Lovely to see everyone.
Hi, I'm Nina Habel. I'm a senior analyst with Stratagen.
Hi, guys. Good morning. I'm Kai. I'm an analyst at Stratagen.
Great. And then the folks at Connecticut Green Bank, Sarah, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hello, Sarah Harari. I am with the Connecticut Green Bank as the Associate Director of Innovation and Senior Advisor to the President.
Alex from Dave Pitney, you want to go next?
Hey, morning, Joe. This is Alex Judd, a partner at the law firm of Dave Pitney. We're assisting the Green Bank and Stratagen in their efforts here. Happy to be a part of the call this morning. Looking forward to it.
Great. Now I'm just going to kind of read through the list, just introduce yourself and who you're with. Andrea, you want to go first?
Hi, this is Andrea Labowie. I'm a senior engineer with Toyota based in Washington, D.C.
Eric?
All right, lots of buttons to click. Eric Annis, I work for Connecticut Deep in the Office of Supply, supporting Lydia on all things hydrogen.
Paul Aresta?
I am Paul Aresta, Executive Director, Council on Environmental Quality.
Aziz?
I'm Aziz Day Khan, Executive Director, Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs.
Enrique?
Hi, this is Enrique Bosch. I'm the Head of Corporate Innovation at Avangrid.
Julia?
Hi, everyone. Julia Dumaine, Connecticut PURA, Supervisor of Strategy and Operations.
Igor?
Hi, everybody. Uwe Pashola, a professor of mechanical engineering at University of Connecticut, member of task force, also the co-chair of the Hydrogen Sources Working Group.
Lydia?
Hey everyone, Lydia Rupert, Research Analyst with Connecticut Deep.
Shannon?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Lawn. I'm an attorney and the Connecticut State Director for Conservation Law Foundation.
Sophia. Sophia from Dave Pitney, do we have you still?
Maybe Sophia, it sounds like you've, oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry, I seem to be.
Yeah, I think we're having a little trouble hearing, but Sophia Browning with Dave Pitney. Alex, if you want to add to that intro, otherwise we'll move on.
No, we can move on. Thanks.
Yep. And then Becca.
Hi, all. Becca Treach, Senior Policy Advisor at Connecticut Deep.
Great. Okay. Did I miss anyone? I don't think we have anyone else who's joined through the phone. So I think we've...
Joe, it's Sam Danowski, she, her. I'm the State Director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter.
Yep. Thank you. Sorry. I don't know how I missed you. I apologize, Sam. Okay. So we can move ahead now. For those that may be new to this working group or might be participating for the first time, I just want to briefly discuss the statutory responsibilities from this working group. We will be submitting a report to the legislature in January, and this working group has two primary responsibilities. The first is to review regulations and legislation needed to guide the development and achievement of hydrogen economies of scale. And the second, which we'll actually be covering first today, includes recommendations for workforce initiatives to prepare the state for hydrogen-fueled energy-related jobs. And I just want to reiterate here that, what we're doing is not intended to replace the stakeholder engagement process that's used to develop and update state policy. Rather, our aim here is to surface new ideas for consideration on how to advance a clean hydrogen economy in Connecticut. So with that, we can talk about workforce development best practices. So, as we're putting together recommendations for workforce initiatives, we develop some best practices to help guide that process. I'll briefly talk through some of those now. The first piece, local and community engagement, that really flows throughout all of this, and it helps to enable the other pieces here. Just the importance of the outreach to local communities and groups, and of course, beginning that as early as possible while ensuring that efforts and communication are accessible, holding meetings at locations and times to enable participation. Also the need for continued communication throughout. Part of that is educating local stakeholders on clean hydrogen. And that obviously flows through across all parts of workforce development. Everyone who's on this call probably has a baseline level of understanding of hydrogen, but some folks out there in the broader community or in the public may not be as familiar. So certainly critical to have that education as an important piece. Community engagement piece does feed into the others. Community benefit agreements can help open up opportunities for local jobs. Some of the key provisions that might be included in those agreements, offering prevailing wages, commitments to use local workforce, partnering with apprenticeship and training programs. And, I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but, this relates from a funding standpoint to ensuring alignment with federal prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements to access federal funding for ITC and PTC benefits. Connecticut also does have Public Act 2143 for projects of 2 megawatts or more. And, that's something that could potentially be a starting point for positioning the state competitively. The other part of all this is, how do you ensure accountability to agreements that are made, or how to prevent loopholes, such as, we talked about 2 megawatts, but, a developer may have 2 projects of 1 megawatt each, or a project that's 1.9 megawatts. So, what else can be put in place to ensure that accountability or enforceability? Another piece of best practices would suggest an examination of workforce needs and gaps, as well as impacts on the local labor market. Are there transferable skill sets such as pipe fitting or welding, or where might additional training be necessary? Another one here are opportunities in related sectors. Connecticut, of course, is a leader in the insurance industry. There's potential for creation of new insurance products involving hydrogen. So, that fits in here as well. And then, of course, the workforce training, the importance of designing programs specifically based on the needs, and developing trade and certifications in key competencies, as well as partnering with local expertise at universities, and with training programs, taking these up as an opportunity to get underrepresented populations involved with efforts to train or upskill workers. And so in the next slide, for Connecticut, some of these best practices help inform what we're developing as recommendations to help enable workforce development. And the first here is just the importance of engaging with local experts in the trades, organized labor, universities, and local community groups. This will help to identify the needs, gaps, and potential for development and training. And then, of course, actually developing that labor force through workforce training programs with a focus on just transition for existing fossil fuel workers. What areas of the workforce are expected to be disproportionately impacted by the clean energy transition, and what are the opportunities to repurpose or retrain workers? And, of course, I mentioned this already, but continuing to build on and leverage the state's expertise in hydrogen and fuel cells specifically, particularly from an engineering standpoint with local universities. And I also did mention the insurance industry on the previous slide, development of new insurance products. This is still pretty new for the insurance industry, so there's an opportunity for Connecticut to be a leader here with some innovative and detailed approaches to risk assessment or underwriting. So switching gears a bit here, I did want to move on to discussion of some of the key findings from the other working groups. But before I do that, I do want to pause, actually. Let's go back a slide and just give folks an opportunity to share any thoughts on some of the findings and recommendations related to workforce development and those best practices. Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks, Joe. I think there's potentially an opportunity to strengthen these recommendations in terms of the equity component. I see that there was one mention of opportunities for underrepresented communities, but I think a way to strengthen it could be, in legislation, also in kind of making it a priority that the training is going to members of underserved communities. Maybe there's some opportunity to align with the federal guidelines, or even do better here in Connecticut in terms of making sure that we're measuring, setting goals and measuring for training, particularly in distressed municipalities and environmental justice communities.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Any other thoughts or response to that? But Sam, I think you're right. Okay. If no other thoughts on workforce, I think we will go ahead and move on here, but feel free to enter any other comments or questions in the chat too. Yeah, I did want to discuss some of the key findings from the other working groups and how that feeds into our recommendations here. And just a quick note that as the other working groups are arriving at their own findings, that does inform our work. And we previously shared a set of guiding principles to help shape recommendations. Part of that is ensuring alignment with existing policy or policy trajectory. There's also a number of cross-cutting issues such as environmental justice, and safety that should be kept in mind in developing all of our recommendations here. So I want to quickly take a moment, the next slide, to walk through briefly what some of the key working group findings are from those other working groups. Sources working group, major finding that renewables, wind and solar in particular, are the lowest cost sources for clean hydrogen production. But, of course, with the state's decarbonization goals for the power sector, there may be some competition for use of those renewable resources. On the uses side, highest priority use cases were developed and identified. I'll go over these a little bit deeper in a little while. But priority was placed on uses that are very likely to use hydrogen or have the potential to create substantial societal benefits, or are in otherwise difficult to abate areas where hydrogen is the only known zero carbon energy source. The infrastructure working group focused on the potential need for the deployment of at-scale hydrogen infrastructure and offtake opportunities, and the importance of incorporating stakeholder community feedback throughout that process, such a necessary piece of infrastructure development. The funding working group found that there are significant federal dollars available for hydrogen, and the state really should aim to maximize access to these resources. Next slide. So with those findings in mind, I just wanted to revisit one of our goals in this working group, which is to review. Oh, go ahead, Julia.
Sorry, did you say you're going to go into more detail on the findings on the previous slide, or was that basically the summary? Oh, okay. So there'll be opportunity to talk about them more later.
Yeah, but if it's relevant now, I would encourage you.
No, I can wait. I can hold it.
Okay, thanks. So, one of the goals of this working group is a review of regulations and legislation needed to guide the development and achievement of hydrogen economies of scale. In our last working group meeting, we shared some of those findings, and in general, Connecticut policy does provide support for the development of clean hydrogen, and there are some existing policies that specifically reference hydrogen, but there are also some areas where further action may be helpful. Some of the workforce development recommendations that we've already discussed, as well as community engagement, but what else can be done to encourage market development and provide support for the highest priority end uses? As part of this process, we've looked at what has been done in other jurisdictions and what is being done to help guide our work here. One piece is, of course, a clean hydrogen definition. We've discussed this a bit before, but we're starting to see a trend away from hydrogen colors, the green, blue, or gray, or pink, and shifting more towards a carbon intensity measure. We're also seeing additional specification regarding feedstocks, stipulating that in order to be clean, it must come from a renewable or a non-fossil source. With regard to legislation, we're seeing focus on end uses such as mobility or electricity generation, as well as some bills to provide additional grant funding, research, or safety provisions. We're also seeing a great deal of activity in market development area with just research studies, pilots, demonstration projects across a number of hydrogen-related topics, hydrogen production, transportation, power generation, of course, long-duration energy storage. So for Connecticut, that bullet, keeping these in mind as we're making our own recommendations, I want to start off with some of what we're proposing here on the next slide. That bullet we had on community engagement, here are some potential actions that could be taken. I think the first batch really revolves around funding to support community involvement and workforce development. In the case of community benefit agreements, there's a lot of additional expertise necessary. For the local workforce, we've heard repeatedly from folks, and particularly when we had folks from organized labor come speak at our last working group meeting, that transportation is a really big piece here. You can get folks trained, but how do you get them to and from job sites? That's something that could potentially be addressed with additional funding. We mentioned Public Act 2143, and how that provides a framework to support community benefit agreements. But currently it's for projects 2 megawatts or larger. So consideration of lowering that to 1 megawatt would allow for some consistency with the federal requirements. Also, fuel cells would qualify under 2143 as renewable resource. Hydrogen isn't specifically included, so there may be some interest in adjusting to include clean or renewable hydrogen within Public Act 2143. Also, establishing a working group of state and local government, environmental justice groups, and other community groups to further address hydrogen-related topics. And developing a community impacts framework to outline both a vision and goals to be incorporated into hydrogen policy development. And so I want to talk here first more about the sources of the hydrogen development and deployment. We have a number of recommendations to consider here. First is developing a statewide vision for establishing a clean hydrogen backbone in the state. What current technologies are available for transport? What are the cost and funding considerations for infrastructure development? How can this be aligned with regional hub activities? And how will community engagement and stakeholder engagement have a role throughout that process? Second one here is expanding support for existing policies and programs that can help enable deployment, and how can hydrogen be incorporated? I just mentioned 2143 as an example of that. That's an existing policy that maybe some adjustment could help enable further hydrogen development. I think the two big ones here related to sources would be the definition of clean hydrogen. Along with the sources working group, we've been arriving at this kind of two-tiered approach. The first one here is as kind of a baseline, establishing a definition that is at least consistent with federal guidance to enable eligibility and participation from a wide range of resources, and could help support access to federal funding, and also, of course, to allow for regional coordination in the event that you'd be potentially importing hydrogen into Connecticut. And then the second tier of this approach would be a more rigorous definition for green or renewable hydrogen that acknowledges the reduced carbon footprint of specific production sources and encourages development of hydrogen production sources that are able to maximize those hydrogen PTC benefits. So this approach would kind of be analogous in Connecticut to, low emission renewable credits versus zero emission credits. You have a baseline, and then you have a second tier that's more stringent. I want to pause here for a bit because I know that the definition is kind of a big one. So I kind of want to give a moment here for some discussion. If folks welcome to chime in on their thoughts on this sort of two-tiered approach. I know it's been discussed in the sources working group as well, but hasn't been put in front of this group specifically. So I would love to hear some thoughts or comments on that. Go ahead, Lydia.
Julia raised her hand first, so go ahead, Julia. I'll go later.
Oh, thanks, Lydia. Well, I guess I'm just curious if we know what other states are doing. I'm taking a page from previous work on appliance standards, which feels like it would not be connected, but a common concern with appliance standards is that states having different standards creates a patchwork effect that inhibits industry and increases costs. So I'm just curious how other states, if we know that are pursuing hydrogen economies, are looking to create their definition, and if they intend to align with the federal government or they are intending to create their own. Because I think if we ultimately want to get to a cost-effective hydrogen future, it might be important to have an aligned, not necessarily saying it needs to be the federal standard, but just having a consistent standard. Otherwise, supply could be more limited.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're sort of an underlying assumption right now, at least regionally, is let's try to get folks to align with that federal standard to allow for that coordination. But I know within the region there aren't yet, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but there aren't official definitions established as far as what we're seeing throughout the rest of the country. Some of them are excluding fossil fuels altogether. Others are going more towards away from this colors definition, more towards an intensity approach. Aaron, I saw you pop up, so if you want to comment further.
Well, Julie, it's a great question, and we asked the exact same thing at the beginning of this process. So I don't know if it updated, but Joe, I attempted to stealth drop in a slide on the next slide that walks through a comparison of some of these regional definitions. Nina, would you see if that slide magic happened? Okay, perfect, lovely. So this should give folks a little bit of a sense. Because Julia, you're right. There's different folks and different countries even are taking some very different approaches here, and so part of why we were proposing this two-tiered approach is so that there is a definition that aligns with federal standards, allows for widespread participation, creates an opportunity to play on that kind of open playing field, but also allows opportunity for us to acknowledge and support folks who are interested in pursuing some of these more robust standards.
Yeah.
All right, that's helpful.
This may look familiar to folks too. I think we shared this on our last working group, but in the interest of not having too many slides on this one, I think we dropped it. But I think it's a great point and just a reminder for folks of, we are seeing sort of several different approaches being taken in other jurisdictions, but that's a great thing to keep in mind. Okay, Lydia, I think you can go next.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to share, DEEP has a different perspective regarding this topic of the clean hydrogen definition, what the task force should do with this. Because from our perspective, we have our process here, our comprehensive energy process that it's regarding hydrogen is in the beginning. We are onboarding a consultant as well to help us with this process. And when we look into the task force mandate and what are the requirements, we do not find that it is required to come up with a definition of clean hydrogen. So since we have this process going on here, we are not, I'm saying this regarding DEEP's position. Okay, so we are not in the position of supporting a clean hydrogen definition of this moment. What we think would be the best way to move forward and the best, what the task force could best do in this moment is recommend further investigation and engagement with stakeholders to research and to analyze if what type of definition would be the most valuable for Connecticut. So Deep Step position is supporting to the hydrogen task force to recommend further investigation regarding this point of view, and not right now recommending a specific clean hydrogen definition. So that's I wanted to share.
No, that's very helpful, and I think that part of our role here is putting forth, hey, best practices suggest this. Here's a good approach to consider, but ultimately, the state and others, and it'll involve a lot of coordination and further discussion and examination to arrive at something if you choose to do that. But Aaron, it looks like you have something to add.
Yeah, well, I actually had a follow-up question for Lydia. So just Joe, if you go, or Nina, if you go back to the previous slide. So I do want to note that we're not defining that more robust, like renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen, right? So I'm more saying like you should define this. So I don't know, Lydia, if DEEP is thinking that, hey, we shouldn't define anything at all because we don't want to do anything yet, and we we need appropriate processes, or if, okay, you're nodding when I said that, like, don't define
Yeah,
anything right now.
yeah. Our position right now it's for not defining anything right now because we are in the process still of doing this.
Okay.
So we are not in this moment yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful. And we definitely welcome feedback from stakeholders on like whether they feel like that is going to be a helpful approach here, and whether that's like the direction that folks feel like this is going to be really good for us in terms of getting to alignment and you know, being responsive to some of the questions that have come up. Sorry, Joe, I'll get out of the way now.
No, that's fine. We've got a number of hands raised, so I want to make sure we hear from everyone. Ugur, I think you're next.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up the discussion. This is actually discussed at length at the sources group meeting last week. And I think the conclusion was that if Connecticut was going to define its own clean hydrogen, it better has a good reason, right? We have to make sure that there is a reason for us to define our clean hydrogen unless we're following the federal definition. And one thing that I want to make sure that everybody notes that the federal clean hydrogen definition is not set yet. There are actually two definitions, one in the infrastructure bill that describes 2 kilograms per kilogram of hydrogen, 2 kilogram carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen at the site of production. And Infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, defines as 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide, what they call life cycle analysis, which I don't agree is more like a well-to-get analysis, but per kilogram of hydrogen that includes the emissions associated with the cost. So I think this is, again, going back, we better have a good reasons if we're going to define our own definition.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll add too that I think when we've shared some best, initial findings of best practices with a definition, yeah, we've seen that just as the trend is going away from defining it by colors, it's also going to this well to gate sort of definition. So I appreciate you bringing that up too. I'm going to try to go through questions in order here, but I think Andrea, you are next.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just step back for a second and confirm that the reason Connecticut wants to create their own definition is so they can spend their own grant money on projects. Is that correct? Is that why they need a separate definition that's in addition to the federal definition? Because people applying for federal money use the federal definition, so Connecticut doesn't need to be involved. I guess that's the first half of my question.
So I think something that we've seen quite commonly in a number of states is that to the extent that states have programs or incentives or are establishing any sort of state-based regulation and regulatory activity, is important to have a definition of clean, green, renewable hydrogen that folks are working with. So if some states are saying we're going to be using the federal definition and that's what we're adopting, but unless that is acknowledged by the state, it will be very difficult to understand, for example, eligibility to participate. So I think that was a lot of the motivation here for asking the question of, how should Connecticut be thinking about this definition?
Okay. The reason I'm asking is because if it's for regulations, I understand the desire to be aligned, but if it's for the state spending their own money, I don't see a reason for them to be aligned, because if you're just increasing the amount of money that certain projects apply for, if there's a technology that's beneficial to Connecticut that you want to pursue, there's no reason that a project couldn't be eligible for Connecticut funds, but not for federal funds. So you could kind of tip the balance toward something that you might prefer, or that may be particularly beneficial for Connecticut.
Right. And I think, but I think part of what you're flagging there is that then there would be sort of distinct definitions for Connecticut that would allow Connecticut to pursue policies that felt were in its sort of best interest. Is that
correct? Yes, and I'm putting that more in the context of incentive dollars. If there's other contexts, of course, I understand. the desire to be aligned. But when it comes to incentivizing your own projects, I don't see a particular need to be aligned in your definitions.
Okay. Okay, that's really helpful feedback.
Brian, I saw you pop up on screen. I didn't know if you were going to chime in here too, related to this question. If not, that's fine. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but.
Oh no, I was I was just getting done my other call and just popped on. I'll defer to the committee members.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. I think Shannon, you were next with a raised hand on this.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to raise one point. I think in the slide, Aaron, that you added that had been discussed in another working group, it looks like those were all definitions that other states had adopted by legislation, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think that's an important part of the discussion here, where are we thinking about like a working definition that could be updated, for example, as federal definitions may shift, or as the technology advances, et cetera, versus like kind of enshrining something in statute that then would take legislative changes. I think that's important to consider. And maybe in these early stages, it might be more advantageous to have a more flexible working definition. And that also leads to a question I have for Lydia, or as to the anticipated process. I think you mentioned that there would be a consultant that DEEP is bringing on, looking at hydrogen and how to define clean hydrogen in the comprehensive energy strategy. So if you're able to share a bit more about the anticipated timeline and process for that and how that would dovetail with this working group and with the regional hydrogen hub proposal, that seems like it'd be useful for us to understand.
Yeah, I think I can actually jump in there. This is Becca. So in terms
Thank you,
of,
Becca.
of course, I got Lydia. So in terms of timing and process there, yes, we are onboarding a hydrogen consultant right now. I think for those that have been able to attend some of the comprehensive energy strategy tech sessions, we had committed to working on several white papers on specific topics based on what we had heard from recent technical sessions. One of those white papers we expect to be focused on hydrogen. And so in terms of timeline, we're very hopeful to have, some kind of first draft done, hopefully in January sometime. That said, holidays and everything else, we're going to do our best in terms of timing. So don't hold me to timing there, but because that process is underway and we expect all of the white papers related to the comprehensive energy strategy to have public meetings associated with them and additional opportunities for feedback, and of course multiple iterations of those draft white papers so that we can continue to get everybody's perspective. We were very hopeful that process might be the best place to continue this conversation beyond the task force.
Sarah, I think you had your hand raised at one point. It may have been in response to another comment, but I want to make sure we didn't miss you here.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. This is maybe something that the Green Bank and the strategy team can take back offline. One of the directives is to examine the sources of potential clean hydrogen, and then it sort of lists what the state is defining as clean hydrogen. And so in order to, achieve that directive, I think we'll need a definition to work off of. Whether we can do that with the federal definition or another is probably a good point of discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. Any other thoughts specifically related to this discussion around definition?
This is Brian. I guess, and I apologize for coming in late. I did have another call. I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is one of those things where as the report comes out, we could potentially say there was no clear consensus, and that's okay. I mean, I think it's going to be, this is one of those sticking points, right? So I think it's very important to get the feedback, collective feedback, ensure that the feedback is included. But, whether we use a federal definition, whether we're silent on this, I don't know if we have to. I mean, I don't know if we have to answer that. But we could just say that, this was an area of, this is my take.
Yeah, great point. Aaron, go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, this is helpful, and I think, you know, I know we're hearing a lot of different perspectives. I don't know that any of them are necessarily in direct disagreement at this point. You know, I think we're pretty clear in our recommendations that we are not recommending a specific definition, right? Either for clean hydrogen or for renewable or green hydrogen, whatever folks want to call it, so much as saying that a definition should be established. And if the appropriate process is to establish that through some of the working sessions that DEEP is intending, I think that's you know, actually a really excellent forum to continue some of these conversations. And I think aligns with some of the points that Shannon has been making about the need for this to be a little bit more flexible, as opposed to, you know, a legislative mandate that then requires, you know, legislation to change. So I saw a thumbs up from someone. I don't know who that is, but I appreciate that. I think
it's me, Lydia.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Lydia. So I think, you know, our goal here is to provide as much, to Brian's point, like consensus guidance as we can, without, you know, going past that or you know, recommending things that folks would be uncomfortable with. So I think big questions that we had that would be really great to kind of hear answers from folks is this, you know, this, whether it's concept of, or laying out this concept of a tiered framework makes sense to folks and feels like is going to be helpful for you know, some of the goals and kind of policy activities that are ongoing, and whether some of the approaches that we've been talking about here in terms of going from a recommendation that says you should go out there and work on definitions, and the process that's been talked about in terms of getting to a final definition, whether those pieces generally make sense to folks. I know there's a lot of questions in that one question.
Go ahead, Becca.
Yeah, great. So I think just to maybe put a finer point on it, even that tiered structure, I think there's still ongoing discussion about whether or not that's the appropriate approach. And so I would just love to give everybody more time and opportunity to give that feedback so that we can figure out what is most appropriate, because I'm hearing competing things, right? Maybe there is a desire to have something that is a more stringent definition, but there's also a lot of pull to have alignment across the region. So I will just say I'm not even sure that recommending that tiered structure has consensus yet.
Yeah, that's great feedback.
Yeah, and as you said in the beginning, Erin, we will have much more other opportunities of engagement throughout our CES process. So I think this could be more developed, well developed during this process. So yeah, and including, and we also anticipate to have public meetings and maybe reading comments also for this process. So there will be plenty of opportunities. So yeah.
Yeah, and I just also want to call out in the chat, Andrea, thanks for this comment too, of this idea of, you know, considering incorporation of a federal definition just by referencing it rather than, you know, verbatim copying it into their own statute, right? Just referencing the federal definition. So as that continues to be better defined and potentially updated, then it would sort of link to it that way as well. I appreciate that comment. Would welcome any other thoughts on that. Okay, and again, if any other comments on this, please feel free to raise your hand or enter in the chat, but we'll go ahead and move ahead for now. And if there's more discussion in the next 15, we can certainly pause for that too. But did want to hit on the last bullet here with regard to sources and development. You know, this somewhat points to what Lydia was suggesting is, you know, just more discussion is needed, more coordination is needed. This idea of establishing a multi-agency work group to address several of these, the many multi-sectoral opportunities and barriers associated with clean or renewable hydrogen. A lot of coordination will be necessary for both the development and deployment. A lot of issues related to infrastructure as well. A great deal of coordination needed across multiple agencies potentially. So just wanted to wrap this slide up by flagging that, but go ahead, Andrea.
Hi, if you're interested in kind of a model of this interagency work group, California has an organization called GoBiz, and they're under the governor's office, and their purpose is to make sure that targets are reached by aligning multiple organizations and addressing industry questions. And so maybe talking with them might be a good way to kind of learn how they do what they do.
Yeah, super helpful. Okay, so let's skip ahead 2 slides now because I know we added in that additional one. So I want to talk about use cases here, and Julia, this may be where you wanted to chime in with more detail on some of the findings of the other working groups. So I'll welcome that now, but or after I talk through this a little bit. But I did just want to pull up a reminder for those that may not have been following the uses working group as closely. Just want to talk about what's come out of that group as they've identified the highest and the high priority use cases. I mentioned this earlier. A lot of the focus was on those that are likely to use hydrogen due to the underlying economics, or those that create substantial societal benefits. So some of the highest priority use cases that were identified out of that working group were uses for critical facilities that need 24-hour backup. Certainly aviation, and this is long and medium haul, cargo ships, material handling equipment, long haul heavy duty vehicles and trucks, fuel cells for power generation during peak, as well as high heat industrial processes. And then the second bucket here is the sort of high priority, maybe not as much as the highest, but those that still have a strong financial case for using hydrogen and also still do create pretty substantial societal benefit, but perhaps on a smaller scale if it's a smaller industry. Good examples of these would be like long distance bus routes, commuter buses, and other heavy duty vehicles that have the lower driving ranges, ferries, freight rail, fleet vehicles with long uptimes and specific refueling locations. And the other one that came out of there was hydrogen blending, potentially in natural gas pipelines for non-core customers, like power generation or industrial heat uses. And then this third bucket is sort of uses that could potentially have value. Keep these in mind as economics and opportunities develop. There could be more value here for market development. We've got hydrogen blending here, privately owned light duty vehicles, low heat industrial processes, short haul aviation. So I did want to just kind of pull these up because, we're making recommendations in this working group, but of course being informed by the findings of these other working groups. And again, I know Julia, you had mentioned on the slide where we talked about some of the findings. Just want to see if you had anything to add here.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this is implied by what's included here, but I just wanted to kind of ask if it was considered at all, I think with the idea of creating substantial societal benefits, I just think as a litmus test, looking at priorities that directly support key state policy goals and how each of these would support that policy goal as a prioritization framework for the state. And because some of these other things, like, they create a societal benefit, maybe they have their own financial case to pursue it anyways, but maybe things that we need to focus on more directly are things that support the 100% zero carbon electric sector targets, the ZEV MOU. Just like I think it's implied here, but I'm just wondering if it's worth specifically calling out that the priority might want to be identify if there's a stakeholder advocating for a particular prioritization, identifying how it supports the state's specifically how it supports the state's overall goals might be a useful way in which the state can identify which priorities it is focusing on and why.
So Joe, I can chime in on that. Just I know that the uses work group has been spending a lot of time kind of digging in on these pieces, and I do think they have some pretty robust documentation on some of the items that you're identifying, Julia, in terms of emissions reduction potential, like local air quality emissions reduction potential, some of those kinds of things, workforce opportunity. So if it would be helpful to folks, we're certainly happy to send that material around. I think part of the feedback that we received through the uses work group was that that material I think was really helpful for the initial research and analysis, but folks didn't want to be overly specific in listing some of those out as we bubbled up to some of these higher level kind of recommendations on prioritization, just because there is potential for uncertainty given the way that this industry is evolving and sort of the timeframes that we're looking at. But if that's getting to some of the questions that you're raising, we're certainly happy to share that material with folks. Julia, did I get to your question, or did I misunderstand it?
No, I think that's helpful. I don't think I articulated what I was trying to say very clearly. I think just if in the case that the state is trying to identify in a strategy priority areas, I think that they should be clearly, there should be clear, I think that yes, emissions reductions, workforce development, all very important societal benefits, but I think identifying clearly how they support state policy goals, like definitive state policy goals that we have, is a useful way to frame our overall strategy, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
And I think that these are high level, but I think maybe just pulling from some, I don't know. I think if we are looking at multiple new applications, like if we're trying to target any funding towards things, I'm just wondering, if that's been part of the discussion, I guess. But it sounds like it has been, and I think I'm probably raising a redundant point. So apologies.
No, I think it's a helpful reminder. And, that was, I think, a big part of why we were up front saying, like, hey, let's get some of these policy goals and objectives out on the table so that we can talk about these things. So to the extent that it would be helpful for folks as they're thinking through the implications here and how this carries forward into policy, there's definitely some work we could do to sort of map back to some of those original policy goals and objectives that folks shared with us.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that as we're finalizing things and developing the report, just contextualizing it that way and making clear those linkages, because it is sometimes easy to get separated from that too. So I think that's very helpful nuance. So we can go ahead, Andrea.
You might notice that one thing that's conspicuously absent is, for instance, light duty transportation. So I think it's important to kind of clarify what prioritization means and what it doesn't mean. One of the things that's prioritized is things that might need, for instance, policy support, but it doesn't mean that the state's not interested in decarbonizing or supporting transitions in other technology, because I'll be very sad if someone uses this prioritization matrix as an excuse to say we're not going to invest in light duty transportation, or we're not interested in that. It's more of what it doesn't necessarily need a lot of policy intervention, because the policies and the incentives are relatively already in place.
No, that's an excellent point. I think you're absolutely right as we're framing this, to not lose sight of that too. And this isn't necessarily a zero-sum game either. So Yeah, I appreciate that. Super helpful. So we've got about like 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure we move along just a little bit here. With those use cases in mind, here's some actions that could be considered. The first is establishing a low carbon fuel standard, similar to what was done in California to reduce carbon intensity. Also potentially expanding clean transportation incentives. Consider broadening some dockets potentially to incorporate or address opportunities to decarbonize hard to abate sectors. And then, of course, tax exemptions for hydrogen vehicles or for critical facilities that produce or use hydrogen. Welcome any additional thoughts on these. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but want to make sure we get some comments or feedback if folks have it. Okay, we can move ahead then. And again, folks are always welcome to enter it into the chat, or actually we'll be talking about in the slide comment opportunity to give comments here. We'll quickly just pull up. This is the working group meeting schedule. Our next working group will be on the 15th at the same time. So stay tuned for, I think an invite's already been sent out, but stay tuned for more info on that. But I want to skip to the next slide here in a couple minutes to just talk through the timeline of things. I did just mention there's additional opportunity to provide feedback or comments. We have developed a public request for written comments. We're asking the comments be submitted by December 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern. And this is just an opportunity to formally submit written feedback that we can consider for inclusion as a stakeholder perspective as we're preparing the report. So folks, if you develop any other thoughts, please do provide comments. There'll also be a webinar and listening session on December 8th. And that's an opportunity to formally submit verbal or written feedback that can be included as stakeholder perspective in the report. I think I saw Shannon pop up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question on the public comments. Are those going to be included in like an appendix to the report?
Yeah, I think we're also, and Aaron, you can chime in too, but as we're developing the recommendations, we want to make sure we're documenting and capturing stakeholder feedback. So, for each of the 7 essential, like the 7 areas we're looking at here as part of this is we want to include key stakeholder feedback that we've received throughout this process, because as Brian has mentioned, we may not reach a full consensus on many of these things too. So we want to make sure we're documenting these, diverse opinions and diverse comments, and a lot of good points being made. So we want to make sure we have those in there. But Aaron, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just say, I think we're definitely interested in that. I think the latest legal opinion, and Brian disagree with me here if I'm misremembering, is that would be possible, but we definitely welcome feedback from folks about whether like inclusion in the legislative report would make folks feel like, uncomfortable with sharing some perspectives, or if actually there is, a strong vote in favor of being included. So we definitely would be happy to take that feedback.
Any other questions on that process? Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, but I want to just quickly go through the rest of this here. We're going to be sharing our draft final recommendations from all the work streams at the next task force meeting on December 13th. And there'll also be an opportunity for the task force to review the draft. And final report will be submitted January 15th. So, it's about 6 weeks away, but we've got some holidays in between there too. So not a lot of time left. So we're excited to be continuing with next steps and finalization here and getting additional feedback. So with that, I want to, thank you all for tuning in here and for your participation. Super helpful comments and questions raised today. If you have any additional ones, please do. You can email me, or as I said, additional you can submit additional comments through the process we've created here. So with that, unless anyone has anything else to add for the good of the order, I think we can go ahead and adjourn. But want to again thank everyone for your participation today and for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.